Hello and welcome to this new series on our channel, one that doesn't currently have a name, although it will do when it's been uploaded, obviously. Um, and it's a series where we are going to be looking at films in a slightly different way in which you usually do. It's less of a discussion this time around, and more of a quick kind of collection of our thoughts. It won't just be me, it'll be Albert on there as well. It'll be more of an individual thing, obviously. And yeah, this is our first film for this new type of review. It's Tallulah, from the creative mind of director Sian Heder. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, but um, and it's one of Netflix original films, quote unquote. It came from Sundance in January 2016, and Netflix basically acquired the distribution rights just before it premiered. Um, so what the kind of Netflix original tag seems to translate to is licensed by Netflix rather than produced by Netflix, but nonetheless, so to give some context to the actual film itself, it's actually based on a short film by the same director. It's called Mother, made back in 2006, featuring a similar plot. It and Tallulah were reportedly based on a personal experience the director had working as a child carer. And if you're interested in learning more, I would recommend looking that up and watching the short film. It's a pretty interesting story, I have to say, especially if you've watched this film or, as I said, the short film. That said, the fact that it was a short film to begin with made me skeptical. Films from recent memory that have been based on short films haven't been very good, mostly due to lacking pacing. Their creators seem to kind of overestimate their premise or idea, thinking that it can maybe stretch into an entire movie when it can't. First thing that comes to mind is the horror movie film Frozen. Not the Disney musical, obviously. The horror movie about three skiers on a chairlift, and that's the whole film. And that's not to say that that kind of short premise can't work, but sometimes it just works better as a short film. Thankfully, though, I have to say, for Tallulah, this isn't the case. Without wanting to spoil anything, I'll say that rather than trying to stretch the plot rather than trying to stretch the plot of the short film across a kind of feature-length film, it seems to just kind of have the same amount of time spent with plot and and for the rest of their time they used for character development and kind of extending the plot into unexplored territory. So there's definitely value in seeing this, even if you have seen the short film. And there's definitely no pacing issues. Although there is one, I have to say, but I'll get onto that later. But aside from that, the film, I think, took its time to develop these characters as well as it could have done, in my opinion. So we're talking about the story. The story of this film is meant to be told through its characters. It's derived from like a single, as I said, very emotional experience as a director. As such, the story itself is interesting but simple. A hippie-ish young woman, by mostly pomp and circumstance, steals a baby from a mother who's neglectful, and so the plot is driven by a kind of raw emotion, and then therefore it's down to the performances of the cast to actually sell the story to you, and for the most part, they are successful. Ellen Page, who plays Tallulah, plays her very well, although it's definitely not a character we haven't seen her play before. If you've seen anything with Ellen Page and Ellen Page has been in the past, you can kind of recognize this character, slightly apathetic and narcissistic, but also quite likable young woman that's been in a few of her films. She's played that role a few times before, but nonetheless, she plays it convincingly, and so it didn't really affect my enjoyment. as a whole. Similarly, Allison Janney does a great job as a kind of older figure. I liked how their personalities clashed, but by the end, I was kind of sold that they had grown this bond together. It's not anything new for that kind of character's relationship to exist in a story, but they definitely sold it. And as I said, this film takes its time with its characters, so if you're going to have that kind of character relationship, you're going to have to, if you do it right, then that's a big plus. If you rush it, it's quite like a, because in real life, that kind of thing doesn't really happen a lot. But if you take your time explaining it through your characters, then that's ultimately going to improve the film as a whole. I also have to give props to their improv skills. Now, that might sound strange since this is a film; it does have a script, excuse me, I haven't found actually any evidence to support this, but I can only assume that since this film, one of its main characters is a baby or a toddler, besides certain points where obviously they needed it to do something like cry, where they would cut to when it was crying and it was, they would make it do certain things, they kind of let the baby do what it wanted, and it spent a lot of time just, wandering around, picking up stuff, and the actors they seemed like they had to just play along with it. And as I said, I can't say for certain that this wasn't scripted, but it seems more than likely that it was, and as a result, I hope it was, because as a result, it definitely helped to sell me on Tallulah's relationship with the child, after seeing how naturally she responded to and interacted with her. Now, if I had to pick one issue, would be, as I alluded to earlier, the pacing, in particular towards the beginning. Now, as I said, the rest of the film is paced, I feel, perfectly, but arguably the most important part I felt was a little bit rushed. Now, towards the beginning of the film, this isn't really a spoiler because it's the premise of the film. To be honest, it's so towards the beginning of the film, she, as I said, by circumstance, she gets into the apartment of a woman, and she finds that the woman is neglectful towards her child. So eventually, after spending an afternoon with her and bonding with her, she decides she wants to steal the baby from her mother. Now, it's difficult to say, but when I first watched it, it struck me as a bit of an inconsistency, since there was just not very much time dedicated to this building of this relationship to begin with. Now, it's worth mentioning also later on, I was completely sold on her relationship and her bond with the child. I can understand how strongly she felt about it towards the end, but in this specific example, I think it was slightly rushed, although there are plenty of arguments to kind of defend this. For a start, she is shown to have broken the law several times before this instance, so it's clear that the law, abiding by the law, doesn't really worry her, although this is quite a step up from robbing a few petrol stations and stuff. And also from a creative standpoint, as I mentioned, the director was in a similar position herself, except she decided to make the opposite choice. So it kind of, the short film and this film serve as a kind of what-if scenario. So a what-if scenario to see what would happen. So it's kind of like, she did have to take it. And I'm not implying that there's no way that anyone can make this kind of decision, and as I said, I was actually completely sold on her making that decision in the end, but it was just to begin with, like, my initial kind of viewing is I felt the relationship wasn't built on quite enough. Like, if they had, and it doesn't seem like this is a timing issue either, since it was under 2 hours long, the film, so in this very specific example, I think they could have spent a little bit more time on it, and I would have kind of been less hesitant to accept this relationship and this decision earlier on. But aside from this, I thoroughly enjoyed it. The journey of this film just feels like an emotional roller coaster that ends satisfyingly but realistically. There's no kind of Hollywood-esque ending, but it's also not. It doesn't just fizzle out. It's a satisfying conclusion, and it's just a film that was driven by a lot of heart that you don't actually see a lot. It made me realize you don't see a lot of this kind of emotional drive behind this kind of high budget films. And despite my earlier comments about Netflix, I have to give them some credit for not always going with the kind of Hollywood modern trend of investing something and actually investing something slightly more artistic, slightly more experimental. Not massively so, but still, it's something that's not what you see every day, and I appreciate that. And if you look at the kind of stuff that's being released nowadays, it's easy to kind of see a trend, and it's nice to see that Netflix, to some extent, is trying to break that trend or trying to experiment outside of it. If you have a Netflix subscription, I would definitely recommend you giving this film a try, since it's free. Um, so, and if you can acquire it by any other means, DVD, rental, maybe, I would still recommend that. Also, as I previously mentioned, I would recommend looking up the history behind this film, the creative history. It's a very interesting story, and also the short film that it was based on. It's definitely worth watching. With all that in mind, thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time.